You're listening to Content Logistics, a podcast for B2B marketers looking to build a content engine that drives revenue. In each episode, Camille Trent interviews the marketers behind the best content marketing flywheels and uncovers the tactical aspects of content production, from first draft to first customer.
Q, thanks for coming on.
Nice to be here.
So for those who don't know, Q's real name is Qasim, and we met each other at Adcetera, which was my very first job out of college. And it's an advertising agency in Houston, and Q can tell us more about that as we go on. But some of the things that are pertinent to this conversation is a lot of the work that we did together, collaborated on together at that agency, was around brand, positioning, messaging, copy. So I thought it made sense to get him on and talk about the differences between those things. So let's just start there. The basics. What's the difference between brand, positioning, messaging, copy? Are they all the same?
Well, I think they're not the same. I'm sure...
I'm giving you a softball here.
I'm sure your audience, being as educated as they are, know they're not the same. But we'll deal with brand later. Let's just talk about the other three. Positioning, messaging, copy. Positioning, if you want to go theory abstract, right? It's relevant differentiation. It's how you figure out what makes you, whether it's you company, you product, whatever. What makes you different. Messaging, which I think is going to be the bulk of our discussion. Messaging is how you put that positioning in, make it actionable. Turn it into things that content marketers, product marketers, etc. can use. And the last thing you said was copy, right?
That's right, yeah.
So if I understand how you're talking about copy, you're talking about marketing copy or advertising copy. Copy is taking that messaging and putting it to even more specific uses. Because if the messaging is making the positioning actionable, right? This positioning, it's fine, I know how I'm different, but what am I supposed to do with that? That's what the messaging is for. The copy is for very specific uses, for promoting a specific part of that positioning, promoting a specific campaign, what have you.
Yeah, I think
does that make sense?
I think that's a good breakdown. Yeah. Well, we can get into this part like a little bit more, because I'm curious if you agree with this. I guess I kind of put positioning and messaging because in the tech world, like a product marketer might be the one to deal with this, and even in the agency world, like the strategist might be the one that's kind of like leading these discussions. So I put those kind of in the strategy framework type bucket, and then to me copy is a little bit more of the execution. So you need the strategy, you need the brief, you need basically the guardrails to operate within, and positioning gives you that, messaging gives you that. Those are the guardrails that a brand always has when you start to work with them, right? And so sometimes this is manifest a little bit in the editorial guide and the brand guide, whatever documents that you're getting from the top product team in general. So you have kind of all of this to be especially when I worked in copyright, this is my first job, it was here's a bunch of stuff, here's kind of the playground that you have to work with, but there's a fence around it, don't go too off the rails here, and stay within this playground. But there's a seesaw, there's a swing, or there's a bunch of stuff that you can do there, but don't go into the construction. I do too many analogies, and I'm not saying this one's the best, but don't go off and play with the construction site. It's a little too dangerous for you. So that's kind of
wonderful mental picture there.
Yeah, because it's true. Creative copywriter, we like having some boundaries, right? And it's good for all parties to have those boundaries, but I feel those are a lot of the tools that help lead to the execution. So curious what you think about that. I guess you've given some feedback on the analogy, so don't judge my analogy too harshly, but the concept behind it.
Okay, I'm sorry, I may have lost you in there somewhere, but what specific question do you want to know?
Yeah, do you think that positioning, brand, messaging, that's all kind of part of the strategy portion, the framework portion that you would then give to a creative team to execute?
I get what you're saying. Do you see them as the guardrails, the brief, right? Well, yeah, but I would I would definitely put it as more than just guardrails. Guardrails implies that it, the only direction you're being given is to where not to go. And I use that term purposefully. I think messaging, positioning is more so that direction. It's not just telling you where you can't go, but where you should. It's telling you. I'm trying to use your analogy.
No, I think we can go. I think we can get out of the playground right now and use the compass, right? Like I was thinking compass as we were talking. So I think that's a fair.
No, we're sticking with the playground. So it's telling you in the playground of whatever your industry is that we're in slide land. We're all about the slide. We need to do everything we can with the slide. We need to make it shinier. We need to tell people it's the shiniest slide, whatever slide analogy you want to use. We're in slide world. If we change our positioning, we decide we're swings, then that's change of positioning. It's a different audience who likes swings versus slides. I'm losing this analogy too now, but I think you get the point. It's letting you know within the area that you're playing in what's the best area to dig deeper in and from a creative writing standpoint, I want to know what I want to write about, and that's what the positioning and the messaging helps you do.
Nice. I like it. All right, I'll work on the analogy. I think my placeholder one is going to be trains, train rails, something like that. Because then you've got the rails and you have a direction. So moving on to the why. So why go through all this effort for messaging? Like I've been a part of these. Sometimes they take months, right? They're ever changing, as you mentioned. Like positioning for a company might change as the company scales and grows, right? Like they need new positioning. You have to address it constantly, and then ultimately it's not customer facing, right? It's typically like something that's shared internally, and so it's not like the copy is the thing that's translating. A lot of that messaging. That's the thing that's customer facing. So, what's kind of like the right amount? I mean, there's no timestamp that you can put on this, but what's kind of the right amount of time to spend, and like why is it worth going through just all this effort?
Okay, well, a lot to unpack there. Let me go point by point. So you mentioned, it's internal. Why bother with it? Why spend so much time on it? Well, firstly, I'll give a slight counterpoint there that it's internal and external. Some messaging is only meant to be inside the walls. Some messaging belongs inside and outside the walls. Positioning, sure, but then if part of the messaging that comes out of positioning is, say, your key selling points. We both know those can end up in a lot of places, in a lot of collateral, website content, so on and so forth. So some of it is meant to be external facing. Or it's written internal and then translated to the external version, right? It might be shorthand, internal jargon written for the internal facing people and then translated by content marketer or copywriter into becoming external facing, or multiple versions of external facing for different audiences based on the same core principles or core points. So as far as the why, beyond some of the things we just talked about, the obvious, which is gives you direction, helps a writer write to something specific rather than having to come up with stuff or guess, because a lot of what we're talking about today is process, and in my experience, the right processes. Their whole purpose is to avoid guesswork and going back and forth. Could you do without some of this process? Sure. But then I'm handed a brief that doesn't have enough information, so I'm guessing what needs to be delivered, and I'll give you my first draft, my first best guess. And you, client or product team, will come back and say, yeah, but not this. So now I have a more detailed thing, and then I'll come back with it, and it'll go back and forth like this, and then maybe they'll land somewhere they like, but then someone on their team who wasn't involved in this will say, oh, actually, no, we don't agree with this part. So suddenly you have misalignment in the teams of people who are representing that product, that company. You have the content marketers or the agency not on the same page and waiting for clear direction. So can you do without it? Sure. It just ends up in a little bit more guesswork and a little bit more thrash and a little bit more time spent. So to your point about time spent, that time spent early on can save you a whole lot of time down the line, because it's basically like laying a foundation so you don't have to keep building and building and building each and every time. You have that foundation to always rely on. And the last thing I'll say on this is, as far as the why have messaging in general if it's meant to be purely internal? Well, depending on the company or specific part of a company, you will have, let's say, the product engineers making stuff. You will have, administrative leaders. You will have the marketers. You will have the sales teams. You will have the business development and account and relationship teams, and so on and so forth. Depending on the size of the company, you'll have a bunch of different departments who are all in different ways responsible for keeping this engine moving, and different ways have to represent the company. So the primary purpose for this messaging, when it's purely internal, is to make sure they're all singing the same tune. Because it's not just, the old adage that, you get caught in an elevator, somebody wants to know where you, everyone has the same pitch. It's not just that. It's everyone who's important, especially to a small company, should know how to describe that company. If the product person, if the team making the stuff has a really vested interest in making it as best as possible and all these little details, then how they feel what the stuff they're making is, why it's good, why it's different, should be the same as what the marketers think, what the salespeople think, what the administrative leaders think, what the relationship and account managers think. So unless they're all just really good at reading each other's minds, that's where messaging comes in.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. So one thing that came to mind was you talked about it not necessarily being internal. Actually, I agree with that too, because there are some ways in which, especially positioning, is like directly public. So if you look at Gartner, for instance, like big companies that invest in Gartner, or on the mid-market side, something like G2, they're usually having to pick a category, pick which category that they play. And there might be some overlap between, I'm talking like specifically for software companies especially, but they're picking kind of like the category where they play. There might be some overlap, but it's like it's strategic. And then it's like, this is the type of tool that we think that we are. These are the type of people that we think that we help. And so that part is very like public. You're constantly like banging that drum of like, this is what we do. And that waterfalls kind of into everything else that you do, like you said. So there's ways that it more directly reflects publicly. So I think about things like the headline or value props, right? Like if you're looking at like the average messaging doc, like it may have like 3 value props, and like they might not show up exactly that same way on the website, but there's usually like 3 value props like on a website, and it's just going to be like finessed a little bit in the copy, right? And so a lot of those things are almost direct translations of things that are public. And then there's another way, like you were talking about, of just like, this goes back to kind of like the guardrails of like everything from, are we all talking about this the same way? So you have that kind of like internal alignment of like, this is how we're going to go to market. This is how we're going to present ourselves. Some of those like nuances that you have to kind of like spell out somewhere so that everyone's on the same page. And now I think like with AI, like you can take it a step further too. Like I've seen some people experimenting with this, and I'm curious to like experiment with it myself, of like, what if you were able to take like all of those messaging docs, positioning docs, editorial guidelines, like all of that playground guardrail stuff, and you just like feed it to AI, and like,
oh boy,
you use that. I'm going somewhere with this, but like you use that as kind of a way to like interact, whether it's a chat bot or whatever, but to better understand like your actual voice, right? Your actual like company voice. So I know like some people are playing around with this. I'm not the first person to think about this, but some brands are making like their own like chat GPT to kind of represent their voice. And I've heard of at least like 2 brands doing this to, as you said, like help like the entire company speak about their product and their brand in a certain way. So it's interesting to see like how like the evolution of some of this is going to look. So not to get like way too futurist and ahead here, but I did want to call out ways in which you mentioned it's both internal and external, and then the fact that it just feeds everything. So that really is the point. You mentioned time-wise, like you're just going to have to like keep going back and fixing things if there's not a reference point, right? Like this is like our Bible, right? So all right, so this is the part where we talk about the why content marketers should care, right? So like this whole show is specifically for content marketing. It's for like the execution of content. I usually go into a specific content playbook. So for this episode, it's a little different, but I wanted to talk about how content marketers can best use and optimize the positioning and messaging that they've been given, right? Like specifically, like how should a content marketer who's typically responsible for like creating all of this content around your positioning, around your point of view in the market, like we're talking about, like what's the best way for them to do that to create an effective like flywheel content marketing program?
Okay. You'll have to, well, first, for the kids out there, value props equals value proposition. I'm sure everyone knew that though. But now let's educate me. What do we mean by flywheel marketing program?
Yeah, that was very jargony. That's fair to call out. So a program that feeds itself, like that is a closed loop, right? Like where you can keep creating content that feeds the engine, that feeds everything else that you're doing, and that comes from the positioning and the messaging in like a continuous way. So that I saw it put this way on LinkedIn the other day, which I liked, of I think of this now as like the mission of like good content marketing is to become like the go-to resource for your niche, right? So that was Dave Gerhardt that said that, so I'll give kudos to him. But yeah, if that's kind of like the mission of marketing, and I would say it falls a lot on like the content marketers of like, how can we become the go-to resource like for our audience, and how can we be known for this specific thing, right? Whatever your strategic like positioning is, your strategic narrative, how should like content marketers best work with product marketers and use messaging?
Okay. Interesting challenge, interesting hypothetical. Let's put it like this. Depends on, obviously, you're talking about how can they use messaging, brand messaging, to improve how they do this, right? Well, obviously depends on which and how much messaging they're utilizing, but let's just say they're going by positioning, right? And that positioning statement that they have, however long or short it is, spells out specifically what are we talking about, a product here? Let's just say it's a product. What the product's primary benefit is, and who it's for, and why it's doing the thing that it does differently. So from a content marketer, product marketer standpoint, it would be really just think of it, I'm getting into analogy land here, but thinking of it as that's the base of the tree, and how many branches can I create from this? How many different ways can I express that primary benefit? What other audiences beyond the ones that are listed here could benefit from this? How would I express this benefit differently to each of those audiences? How would I express it differently to each of those audiences in different scenarios, different instances, different times of year, different needs or circumstances? I probably already said circumstances, but it's just looking at making sure everything can tie back to this, and just trying to draw as many lines out from that core base, that root, that acorn, whatever growth analogy we want to use here, that trying to draw as many branches as possible in order to build as much content as possible, while still being able to justify that none of this content is we're reaching for stuff. It's all tying back to the same source.
Yeah. No, I think that's great. I think about like saturation with content marketing. If you are trying to become like the go-to source for something, the go-to resource, and eventually you want to cover all of the topics that like fall under your brand's umbrella, like that's a pretty big task. And so if you think about it in terms of, again, like bad analogies, but like tree rings
Love the
from
theme
the
of this
messaging.
episode, bad analogies.
This is just, yeah, this is going to be the title. But no, if you think about like tree rings from that positioning, right? Like, yeah, positioning, messaging, and like radiating out. But like sometimes marketers and content marketers especially like go too far, like under that umbrella where, let's say it's a marketing technology like that I'm trying to sell. And so I'm just trying to create content that appeals to marketers and that's about marketing tactics, right? Like that's probably too wide for the product, right? That's more specifically, that product is probably let's say it's a social media listening tool, right? Like then you want to stick like closer to that. Going back to the tree ring analogy, right? You want to like stick close to like the like social media space and like organic social and like those types of conversations first. Like let's tackle everything that's like that we're actually an expert in, right? And that we can actually like help you solve. Like let's play in that space first before we try and like expand out and own everything, like the whole conversation around marketing. Because one, like you're probably not going to win at that, especially a lot of people are listening or work at startups, right? And so, you're never going to compete against like the biggest. You're never going to compete against like HubSpot, for instance, for all of the marketing teams, but you might beat them at like a very small niche that you're frankly better at, right? That you are like the expert at. And so you might as well like start there and then like don't get ahead of yourself, but then kind of just go with that sort of ring analogy of like, okay, what's the next thing that we do that's like related? And I'll give a shout out to Ahrefs, which is a MarTech vendor. They have this way of thinking about and prioritizing content that relates back to this of basically a 0 to 3 score, and it scores a 3 if it's like if the topic and the keyword is like highly related to the problem that their software solves, right? And it's a 0 if they don't solve the problem. And so they've used like a similar examples, I guess, of like they don't really play in social media, right? Like they play in SEO, so they're going to talk mostly about SEO. There's other things that they can kind of do, but maybe not do the best, and so they're going to focus on those things next. And so this is like, I think like close to the number one maybe like content marketing mistake is just like going way too wide and like trying to own like everything rather than like just like starting with your niche and being like the best possible at that, so you can just be known for that, which by the way is probably going to like lead to more sales and like more success than trying to own everything.
I cannot agree more, especially because this hits on something that from a brand practitioner, smart brand practitioning standpoint is very near and dear, and that is consistency. It's one of the key tenets of just good brand communication is trying to stay consistent. And this is something that in the agency world where you end up talking to a lot of different types and sizes of companies, when you see the same issue over and over again, you realize that everyone is facing the same thing, which is that people get bored of themselves before anyone else does. If you've had the same logo for X number of years, you're tired of looking at it, even if you're not, you're only like 3% penetrated in your market, for example. You've been tired of looking at the same value proposition or tagline. You're tired of the same marketing approach or even the same positioning, which obviously positioning should be altered only when actually necessary, when something tangible is changing. It shouldn't be changed from a cosmetic point of view ever. But point is, if you within the company, this definitely applies to startups. because their whole game is trying to establish themselves. So the better you are at saying the right thing, saying it well, and saying it consistently, the better off you will be. I mean, those three things I mentioned, that's saying the right thing, that's positioning, that's differentiation. Saying it well is the appropriate communication, and saying consistent, that's like differentiation, communication, consistency. That's how you do brand work. So I totally agree with you in the sense of playing too far outside your lane. That if you're to the point, if you haven't done the work of that inner ring well enough, where you haven't been saying consistently enough, where you can do a poll or do a market survey of your addressable market, and the thing that you've been saying forever, everyone knows and understands that that's what you're about, and that's not what your next door neighbor's about, then that's when you should decide, okay, we can do other things now.
Yeah, no, I love that. A couple things that stood out. So I've heard like I think 7 to 10 touch points that customers need right before they buy from your brand or even take the next step with your brand. I think that's even on the low end for B2B. Like, I think you need way more touch points than that, especially for an expensive product. And so to your point, no, yeah, it may seem boring to you or like super repetitive. There's a good chance that one, like people haven't even seen your messaging yet, right? That you haven't saturated the entire market. And then two, what I like to remind people of is they haven't seen the messaging in a way that's resonated with them. So it pays to say it in slightly different ways. And this is like where you talked about, I liked the difference between differentiation, communication. Like that's like a nice, concise way of kind of like thinking about this whole universe. But this kind of like leads into the next thing, since we've been talking about stage a little bit and how this applies to startups. You do a lot of work with enterprise clients. I know you do work with like smaller clients as well, but sometimes like the scope of these projects, these messaging positioning projects are huge and crazy expensive, right? So you're talking about scope, startups versus enterprise a little bit, right? This approach to positioning and messaging can look like a 50-page document, right? It can be crazy expensive and not within reach for the average startup. But I think that there is a bare bones version of messaging that's very attainable for a startup. So if you were to advise a startup, like they're like, hey, I don't have the money to like outsource this to an agency. What do I need so that we can have this like cohesive messaging and positioning throughout our content?
Good question. So what's the bare minimum of brand messaging? If I understand your question correctly, I think we already talked about the first thing, positioning, right? Something very important for every type of company to know, think about, codify, kind of nail down. I think I'd say after that would be elevator pitch. And I say elevator pitch even before value prop, which we talked about before, because I tend to, and you could relate to this from copywriting standpoint, that it's easier to pare down than to take something that's small and try and turn it into something large. It's easier to write a 60-second script and turn it in 30 than do it the other way around. So similarly, I think about having an elevator pitch because it's very important. Elevator pitch serves a lot of purposes. It takes the form of a story or a narrative, which is great because especially for startups, they want to be able to tell their story and do it in a way that's consistent. So person 1 versus person 7 in the company, one's doing a one-line version of the elevator pitch and one's taking 10 minutes. You don't want that level of disparity between the elevator pitch. So knowing what's the most important part of the elevator pitch, what's the beginning of that story, what's the middle meat of that story, and what's the thing I want you to remember and take away. Elevator pitch serves a lot of those purposes. And if you've got your elevator pitch nailed down, then if you looked at it and if you had to just extract one key nugget out of that elevator pitch, if you had to decide, I'm going to put a headline on top of that elevator pitch. What would that headline be? Then you can much better imagine what your value proposition would be, rather than without having figured out the elevator pitch, just trying to think of what's our value proposition, and you're just, there's 5 people in a room just like writing up bad taglines for 30 minutes and putting them on the wall and arguing why that this person sucks and this person's great. It's easier approach than that. Again, process helps. So figuring out the key parts of the elevator pitch, what's the beginning, middle, end of your story as a company, and then trying to use that to get a value proposition. I think those 3 things, I would say, make up the bare minimum.
Nice. No, I think that's a nice, like, simple framework for people to go by. It's interesting. I was just doing like a quick project for a company, and they gave kind of their version of like messaging to start with. And I feel like oftentimes, whether it's a brand guide, editorial guide, messaging doc, like one of the most helpful things for me when I'm trying to translate something into copy is like the do's and don'ts. Is like, this is what we do say, and how we say it, and this is what like we don't do. So I think sometimes like just having some examples of what good looks like to them, right? And what's, especially when they're smart enough to understand like their own nuance, like to the way that they talk, right? Of, you might look at this doc and think this is the way to do it, and they're like, but this is semi crossing over the line for us, right? Like, we don't want it to be like this, we want it to be like this. So just a few like do's and don'ts to add to a messaging doc, especially when you get kind of more to that, again, more like brand guide, editorial doc, like the thing that you're giving to freelancers or you're giving to a creative team to work with. That's always helpful.
Yeah, I mean, your listening audience can't see me vigorously nodding my head because that's the kind of stuff that a brand or a company, I'm just going to use the word brand, they're all brands, that has been around the block for a while has figured out what their do's and don'ts are, because they've tried different things. They've realized what their nuance is. They've realized we can't play in that sandbox. I'm sorry, I promised we wouldn't go back to that analogy. They've realized what their tone of voice is. And it takes a while to figure out. And it takes a while to figure out that we don't need to experiment with a bunch of different tones of voices anymore. This is the one that makes the most sense for it. It's had the most success already. It's got the most internal and external belief. That doesn't come overnight. A startup shouldn't figure out their do's and don'ts at an early stage. They're still in the experimentation stage.
Yeah, and you can always iterate, right? Like, I think hopefully like a founder knows, they usually have some sort of opinion of like the types of companies that they don't want to sound like. Like, I've definitely noticed and like realized this with founders of like, we don't want to be this company. If anything, we want to be more like this company. So even if you can give any sort of like sense of direction in terms of like, this is what we like and don't like, that's always helpful too. Like, this is kind of the editorial like version of a mood board, right? In some ways. Okay, so whether it's people inside the company, outside the company, like, who do you think is best suited to create this messaging? I imagine it's, multiple people ultimately, right, coming together to create messaging, but who's best suited to create this?
That's got to be the toughest question that we've gone over today, Miss Camille. There's no set answer, because you can say everyone, because if we go back to everyone should be thinking have the same mindset about what makes our company different, what we stand for, what our elevator pitch is, quote unquote. If that's the case, then everyone should have a role in creating the messaging. But I think that the crux of your question is who's able to actually write. Because, and this is getting into, not really in the, content logistics territory, but it's coming into the fact that, bad writing doesn't sell, and not everyone's a writer. So it's knowing if you've hired well in your startup or in your SMB or whatever, if you've hired well in your internal marketing team, then knowing who those people are who have that ability, which is kind of a no duh, but also then making sure that they are good representatives of your voice. Those are the people who should be writing this. Now, the one thing I will give as a side answer to this question is, because this I have seen, you and I have both seen probably, is when it's a group effort. Group effort messaging rarely hits the mark, so to speak. When it's done by committee, and some companies believe in that, and if they can do it well, and they think it's working for them, great. But in my experience, it rarely goes, because group effort messaging by committee is, well, I like this word, and Sheila likes this word, and Jonathan likes this word. So let's put them all, or we want to say this, and they want to say that, and it's everyone weighing in. Let's make sure we add a little this in there. It's instead of a defined recipe, it's putting in every ingredient, and then some poor soul has to try and turn that into, real language that someone will want to read. I do not envy that person who at the end is given all the feedback for everyone in the committee, and here, turn this into messaging. It's not a easy thing to do. But because it's the work of people like the company I work for, etc., to do that, frankly, to listen to all the stakeholders, to listen to the entire committee, and turn all their voices into a singular voice, which is why it's ideal if the messaging isn't being written by the community, but everyone's voices are heard, and then one person or entity their job is to actually craft that into messaging. That's a very long-winded way to answer your question, but I hope it made sense.
No, it's good. It's interesting to like hear the thought process, because I'm definitely in favor of it's very hard and not always the most effective to do it by committee, because ultimately, like to really simplify this in my head, there's a brand story. The brand story came from there being a problem, a gap in the marketplace, right? That the founder or founding team identified, right? And so to me, like the positioning and the messaging, like all needs to come from that origin story and that founder, right? And sort of like flow down. So that person should be involved and had probably a point of view and positioning that allowed them to like originally go to market, right? And so not getting
really
like too
jaded and everything, yeah.
Yeah, like I mean, I like it when founders are passionate about a problem, right, and about their product and stuff, and that's usually like what gives them some like success and some traction at the beginning, right? And so not getting like too far away from that, but also knowing that the product evolves. Like maybe the thing that they thought that they were going to make is not the thing that they ultimately ended up making. So it does change, and you have to iterate based on that. And there are probably people best suited to think about these types of things, like sometimes the product marketer, VP of marketing. Like it makes sense that those people would be involved, partly because of the communication expertise, right? Oftentimes those people are experts in communication. And we were talking about being a good writer. Like I think about just being a good communicator and very succinct. So when I think of a good product marketer, for instance, like oftentimes I think the average person thinks about like good writing and like just words that sound good, right? A lot of times when I think about messaging and I think about the frameworks like that product marketers come up with, it's like just very succinct and straightforward, right? And so you might not think of it as like, oh, this is great writing, but it's like a way to convey something like very effectively and in like the best word to value or value to word like ratio, right? Where it acts as like a brief oftentimes, and it acts as like those guardrails that we talked about, right? And so really like being able to summarize like all of that story, like all of the backstory like of the company is what I think of when I think of like messaging, right? And so to your point, like oftentimes having good communicators like help you distill that, right? Good like synthesizers too. Sometimes that's the marketing strategists, VPs of marketing. I think the story should flow from the founder, and it's like those people kind of like working together to like distill this like to basically the minimum amount of words. Like that's like to me like what good messaging looks like.
Yeah, I mean, kind of to your point, facts don't travel, stories travel, right? And that passionate founder that you're talking about, uh, if they've gotten to the point of founding a company to fill that gap, and sorry if you hear a little audio, but if they founded a company to fill up and they're still going at it, then obviously there's intelligence there and there's passion there, and they know how to sell, which means they know how to storytell. The best salespeople are usually the best storytellers.
Nice. I love that. That's a good clip right there. Okay, so getting into some of I'm wrapping up here. I promise this won't go all night. The logistics of messaging for content marketing. You have a few frameworks that you like to go off. So you have sort of like 3-question framework. So if you kind of want to share your 3-question framework for thinking about positioning.
Sure. I don't want to say this is necessarily for positioning, because positioning obviously involves mentioning who the audience is. This framework is more so, I kind of think people, a lot of the terms we use, a lot of the brand messaging terms we use turn into gobbledygook. You know, one person's value proposition is another person's brand promise, is another person's tagline, so on and so forth. So this terminology can get lost. Even the term brand, like we talked about earlier, we said we'd get back to it, can get confusing. I try to create a dividing line between the visual identity of a brand, which all of us can get an idea of. When you're saying visual identity, it's what a brand looks like, versus the intellectual identity of a brand. So that is what concepts and what messages come to mind. And so my framework, my 3 questions, have to do with a simple way of figuring out what the intellectual identity of your brand is. And these are very simple questions. First is, what does your brand do? And it's very simple. It's just listing out everything that your brand does in the space that it does it. It could be a bulleted list, could be a single item. But what does your brand do? Second question is, how is that different from what other brands in your space do? And the third question is, what does your brand want to be known for? So knowing this is what we're here for, and this is what's making us different, but also this is what we want to be known for. If when people think of us, that we want them to think this. Those 3 things combined can help any company of any size either create or check in on their intellectual identity.
Nice. So in that same article that you have that 3-question framework, you kind of follow it up with what I think of as like a way to double check your work. Like, let's say you did put together a positioning and messaging doc for your company. What types of things would you ask to make sure that you've created a comprehensive enough document?
Right. Well, I tied it in that article you're referring to. I tied the checking of your work, the tests, to those 3 questions, just so that it was a easy line to draw there between the 2. So the first test is, once you've answered these 3 questions, testing your answers. And the first test is, can everyone in your company answer these 3 questions? And it's seems so simple, and it can be so provocative depending on the size of the company. And this is why I wanted to put this thought out there, that if you're a startup of 7 people, and sure, it may only take like 1 hour-long meeting to make sure everyone can answer these 3 questions. But if you're a global conglomerate, but you consider yourself a big, efficient, powerful brand, it's still important that everyone in your company can answer those 3 very basic questions. So, first test is, can everyone answer those questions? Second one, and I think you may see where I'm going, is, are everyone's answers the same? which goes back to the thing we talked about earlier, consistency. Because everyone being on the same page, singing the same tune. And obviously this test is way harder than the first test, that everyone can actually have an accurate answer to those three very simple questions. But are everyone's answers actually the same? Is person 1 answering what does the brand do differently than person 17 than person 384? It makes a difference. If people in your company don't know what you do, it matters. So that's the second test. And that ties then, of course, to the third test, which is, again, tied to the earlier questions. How are your answers different from the answers of others in your space? And this, again, is a successively harder question because you have to put yourself in the actual shoes of your competitor and think of, how would my competitor answer these questions? What would their answers be? How are my answers different? Maybe I need to do some market research to see what their messaging is, what they're saying on their website, what they're saying in their collateral, what they're saying in their social listening and what have you, to see how they're talking about themselves, so I can tie that back to how they might be answering these three questions, and how different are their answers to my answers. Because if there's too much overlap, then I need to rethink how my company's answers should be answering those questions. So that's test number 3. How different are your answers from others in your space? And then the last one, this one ties closest to positioning it, which is, and it's the hardest one to do yet, which is how relevant are your answers to your audience? Because that definitely involves some sort of research, some sort of survey, some sort of conversation to be had, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, to find out that, this is, you, Camille, are my audience. I am company X, and I do this, and I do it this way, and I want to be known for this. Is that relevant to you? And if the answer is no, then again, you need to know, how relevant is that to the audience? Because everything, this whole conversation revolves around content and marketing, which is everything you do, everything I do, everything we do revolves around an audience. We can't be just putting content out there that we all think is great and, patting ourselves on the back. Everything has to do with if the audience thinks it's good, if the audience has a connection to it. So that's why that last one is it relevant?
Nice. Yeah, that reminds me of sort of like a basic checklist for journalism that I think I learned in like middle school. That's who, what, when, where, why, and then the who cares, right? It was like kind of that last one that you touched on, right? The relevancy is like the who cares. Yeah, and in journalism, it's about how can you take all of those things and put as many of those as you can into the lead, right? How can you just like lead with like all of that like pertinent information so that people can like easily qualify themselves like in or out of a story. And I think about that for basically all types of communications in marketing, right? So same thing with your headline.
Hold up there. You were taught journalism in middle school?
Yeah, we had a journalism class in 7th grade. Shout amazing. Out to Miss Brightbill because she taught me most of what I know.
I learned that in college. Jesus, what middle school are you going to?
Cedar Ridge Middle School. Getting a shout out here. No, but that definitely stuck with me. I mean, I'm pretty sure like it was kind of reiterated like in college, right? Like those like principles of the inverted pyramid and things, but it applies like to everything of just like lead with the point, right? Don't bury the lead, as they say. But that applies to your homepage headline, applies to what to put like in your messaging doc, right? What to convey to a freelancer, right? And so that kind of just leads to this wrap up here of what advice would you give to content teams who may be in charge of both translating messaging like into the content strategy, right? Into the pieces of content that they write, but also maybe in charge of like an editorial guide, right? Translating like some of what they're given from messaging doc, like into more of a structured like editorial guide that may be used like for freelancers and other people that they're collaborating with.
General advice. I think maybe this is inspired by your middle school story here, but it's to always ask questions, and in particular, the why. It's a trite thing, why is the most important question. But in our business, it almost always is the most important question. If you're being asked to do something, why? Why now? Why this way? Why in this time frame? That why can give you so much more information that you can use. But also generally, I think touched upon this earlier as well, is try to make sure you're connecting back to the source. And that's why I mentioned asking questions. That this whole conversation has been about tying things, writing with the brand in mind, tying things back to the brand. So again, asking questions about the brand before you start writing. And maybe it's some of those basic questions that lead to positioning, or even asking for a company's positioning statement or some of their core messaging or anything to that effect, or at least knowing the questions, because asking a company for their brand messaging can sometimes be impolite question, but especially for a company who hasn't thought it through. So it's knowing what questions to ask that would get you to the same answer. So that's why my general advice would be ask questions and always try to look for the why.
That's great. That's a great takeaway. It's ultimately content writers, content marketers getting on the content flywheel of just making pieces of content. And it's easy to just like lose sight of why you're doing it. And so if you just stop and think, why this piece of content? Why now? Right? And ask those types of questions, it'll probably like save you some extra hours of work that maybe don't need to be there. So great takeaway. The last thing is, where can folks find you?
Oh, I'm not really a social animal, but at QLeftBlank on Twitter would be the space I would direct people to.
Yeah, and for those who may be watching this, you might be able to tell from Q's background that he's a Knicks fan, so you may or may not have some Knicks commentary, I would guess, like on that Twitter. I always give people like that disclaimer for mine.
I may only have Knicks commentary on my Twitter. That may be the only purpose for my Twitter.
Awesome. Yeah, I always give that disclaimer for my Twitter too, because it looks very different for my LinkedIn. And maybe that's a good thing for folks. A very, very niche set of folks who may overlap with content marketing and the MBA. So, okay, cool. Well, always good to see you. Thanks for coming on and talking about that sort of intersection between messaging and copy and content and all of those good things. And it's nice to just like do a full closed loop here of met at Adcetera, and now it's been almost 10 years, almost been like a decade. So maybe next year we do like the actual decade reunion tour here.
Before we wrap up, am I allowed to ask you a question?
Sure, let's do it.
If you had to pinpoint the biggest difference between working as a content marketer and working at an agency as a copywriter, what would you say that difference is?
Yeah, that's a good question. So yeah, I've tried to nail down like the differences between content and copy, and I've like described this a few different times, so I won't get too in the weeds, but I will say it depends on the agency, because I do think at Adcetera and the type of work that we were doing, and I'll give everyone else a little bit of context of, again, working for enterprises, bigger companies, right? And oftentimes like these more like strategy projects, like some, and some execution like type products. But because of that, I think it was actually like a lot of product marketing. Like that's kind of why we got into talking about positioning and messaging, right? And sort of like the big picture for some of these companies. And so I think of it actually as like the strategic marketing of doing a lot of that. I think for what I think of as like tech copywriting, or like the by the book kind of like definition of copywriting is words that sell, basically, right? It's like words that are meant to sell. And whereas content writing is meant to deliver content, like deliver information, right? Like it's meant to be educational, right? So I think stuff that leans toward the educational type content, which tends to be like the more long form articles, like that is closer to content writing, and content marketing is a little bit of that intersection, right? Where it is ultimately meant to sell. Like you are a content marketer because you are marketing something at the end of the day through content, right? And so it ends up being like this blend of content writing and copywriting, right? So I think about things like, and I've made this like analogy before of like a book, right? So when I think of a book, the title page, the cover, like that's to the T, like copywriting, right? Like the cover like sells the book, like they always say, right? People very much like judge a book by its cover, and the copy on the back too.
I've
right?
never
like,
heard that.
You've never heard that? No. So on the back too, like you think about like there's social proof, like we talk about using social proof, like quotes and testimonials, right? That's like what's on the back of a book, right? It's like so and so like said that this book is great, right? And you should definitely read it. And so all of those elements like that you learn from like copywriting like 101 like are in this like analogy kind of a book. And then on the inside, like you have like the actual information, right? Like you have actual content that you can consume that's like hopefully helpful. And so, but like the marriage of those two things, like kind of to me make it more content marketing. So that's kind of like how I split it up. But it's more nuanced than that. Like oftentimes too, like these articles will kind of like sell within the article too. Like I think like there's ways to do it well where if I'm looking for a specific solution, like how to take a GIF screenshot or something. Okay. Sometimes it might make sense to mention the exact type of tool that you should use to do that, right? And like show an example of like what this looks like and like the step-by-step process of how to do that, right? So there's ways to deliver education and content, but still sell a product like at the end of the day. And that is part of content marketing. Now, there's a big asterisk here, and I think the world is like moving away from like this very like transparent, like transactional, like type content. And there's value to basically like pure education and pure like media style content, right? Like where you deliver valuable journalistic content. Yeah. When you deliver like valuable data backed content and it boosts your credibility and it shows, hey, like we're an expert at this thing and we don't feel so insecure that we like have to sell like all the time, and people are like smart enough.
Wary of content that's trying to sell them and looking for content that isn't trying to sell them. Right.
And so like at the end of the day, like you need to realize, that is part of the job. But I do think that there is value in that type of content, journalistic content, data-backed content that is, it's just going to add credibility, and people are going to like draw the line be able to connect the dots, between like what you're doing and, hey, like I got a lot of valuable content out of this blog. I got a lot of valuable content from following Q, right? And so because of that, I'm going to hire him, or I'm going to buy this product. Like I am convinced that like it's like founded in reality and it's like founded in data, right? So I think there is value to kind of like this evolutionary content as well.
Okay, one last question. I promise that's it. But do you think it would have been easier for you to go from content marketing to copywriting, or do you think the shift from copywriting to content was the better path?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm full of them. I like my path. I mean, it's hard because I don't know anything different, and I like the challenges that were along the way. But I think for me, like, again, the type of copy, I guess, that we were working on, the type of projects that we were working on really as an agency were like, it was just like a lot of strategy projects. And so I think that that's always the best place to start. Like that is where all of this starts, right? Is like at the positioning level, right? And at the messaging level. And we worked on that on a small scale, because when you're working with an enterprise, you're often like talking about like the small business unit that's in charge of like releasing a specific type of product, right? And these enterprises have tons of different products, right? And so like you kind of like just
you're
become
on
like
a
the owner
small
of
mission
one
of
thing.
your own, and you don't really get an insight into the big picture.
Yeah, but that product like has its own messaging, right? Like it has like its own like go-to-market strategy too. So you get to do all of it. You kind of get a crash course in all of marketing, just on like a very small scale. It's like, how are we going to think about this particular product and not like, how are we going to think about this whole brand, right? And we did do branding projects as well, but I think like I liked the ones that were like highly applicable of like, okay, here's this messaging doc that you've gotten. Here's kind of the backstory and like where it came from. Find a way to take this to market, to like translate it, to communicate this like to our audience. There's lots of information about who that audience is in a way that's effective, right? So I think like those types of projects are helpful for just understanding the fundamentals of marketing and how to interact with the market and just like how to communicate. So I think it taught me just like the basics of communication. And I think if you are a good communicator, you can be a good content writer and you can be a good copywriter.
That's a nice little wrap up to that.
Like I said, it's come full circle. It's come full circle. All right. Well, Q, I've kept you a long time, and I know it's even later your time. So thank you for coming on, and we'll chat right after this and complaining about basketball.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to Content Logistics. This episode was produced by Motion, a done-for-you B2B podcasting agency for busy marketers. If you liked what you heard, please follow the show on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts.